Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse. Decisions are integral to life. Most of our actions involve taking decisions or making choices, and most of them under conditions of uncertainty. Should I wake up early and go for a jog, or just laze in the comfort of my bed that much longer? Which brand of shampoo, shirt, or car should I buy? School A is slightly better than B, but costs 50% more. Is it worth paying that premium for my child? Should I rent an apartment 40 minutes away from work, which costs $24,000 per month, or the other one, which is only 20 minutes away and costs $34,000? Should a company pay dividends? Should they borrow? Should they take over another company? Decisions, decisions, decisions. Economists believe that all such decisions that people take are taken rationally because humans are rational. Behavioral economists bung some spanners in the works, questioning that rationality. And therein lies the evolution of behavioral economics from the conventional or neoclassical economics. In this episode of BIC Talks, Adjunct Professor Schulich School of Business, York University, V. Raghunathan, and Nikhil Ravichandar, applied behavioral scientists, get into the nuances of human rationality.
The subject is, are humans irrational? That is what Ravichandar came out with. It ties very closely with the title of my book. So the question is, why do we even wonder, are humans irrational? What exactly differentiates humans from animals? If you ask that question, you would say, well, maybe we are a little more thinking as people. We think more consistently. We think a little more logically. We think a little more rationally as compared to animals, or at least some may think that. If so, that would make humans probably more rational than irrational because there is some pattern to their thinking processes. That's what one would think. But then the question is exactly what is rationality? See, rationality has been defined by classical economists in a certain way, mostly in economic terms, obviously, because they're economists. The rational human being will prefer more to less. More money is preferred to less money. More of good things is preferred to less of good things. So the first point of rationality is wanting more rather than less. The second one could be a rational person for the same level of a good thing will prefer an option which has a lesser risk as compared to the option which has a higher risk. A rational being also typically has a marginally diminishing utility, which means, like, if you take a child and say, take this bitter medicine, the child will say, no, unless you give me a lollipop, I'm not having any bitter medicine. So you give the first teaspoon of the medicine and give one lollipop. But if you want the kid to have a second dose of the same bitter medicine, he may want two lollipops or she may want two lollipops. Which means as the risk increases, they want a higher return. And that is part of the rationality. So there are a whole lot of definitions. For example, there are other definitions which go with rationality, that you think consistently, you think with all the information in place, you are able to process all the information to the entire logical end before you take a decision. Now, obviously, the rational economists said this is how humans take decisions. And they said a rational human being will be all these things. All these characteristics define a rational human being. Basically, what they were trying to say was any decision that you take, any decision making of individuals or groups of individuals or corporates, they're all based on the assumption of the decision maker being a rational person. Their problem was, if you were irrational, you didn't even fit into the definition of what the economists were trying to study. So if you were irrational, you were not a subject of the economists at all. So they postulated who a rational being is. They assumed that you are rational in that sense as they have defined it, and that is how you take your decisions. This was the meaning of rationality. Then some people came along and said, hang on, we found that even rats are rational in the laboratories. Now, how the heck do you determine whether rats are rational or irrational? Several kinds of interesting studies have been carried out on rats. One of them, for instance, is you have several pathways. Rats run from one end to the other end. One end has some food which changes at random. So on an average run, the rat can expect 5 grams of food or 10 grams of food or 15 grams of food and so on. But at random, which means you won't get 5 grams on every run. But if you make 30 runs, on an average, you'll get 5 grams. So it's probabilistic in that sense. And then they change the voltage of current on the pathway, which is the risk. And then they figure, how does the rat choose the pathway for the amount of food that it expects at the other end? If the expected food is higher at the other end, it's willing to take a higher shock. But it will not take a higher shock if the food at the other end is expected to be less, which is coming close to the rationality assumptions that we were making. Risk remaining the same, you want more food. Food remaining the same, you want less risk, and so forth. And they also found the next order. For every additional unit of risk, they wanted even more food at the other end. Okay? So in this sense, rats were found to be rational. There was another experiment, which was like giving some money to the rats and seeing how they spend it. Now you may wonder, how on earth do you give money to the rats? Well, behavioral economists are smart. Kogel was the guy who came up with this experiment where there could be 2 levers in a cage. It taps on one lever, and maybe after 2 taps on that lever, it gets a certain quantum of food. On the other lever, after 1 tap, maybe it gets some water. So the entire food for the rat is food and water. And the number of taps required to get that food or to get that water is like the money, the tapping on this thing is the currency that it has. But the total quantum of food and the total quantum of water, there is a ceiling, which means there are number of taps are limited. In all, it can make 10 or 15 or 20 taps during the day. Then what they do is they change the composition of the taps required to get food or water, which means my total taps is my daily income, but how many taps I make for either food or for water is the money that I'm spending. And when they change this, they found the rats very quickly learn to budget their taps to maximize the food intake or maximum utility, satisfaction of the food intake. If you make the food more expensive by asking for more taps, total number of taps is limited. So it has to make 6 taps to get food and only 2 taps to get water. Very soon the rats learn how to optimize the taps between the food and water so as to maximize the utility for themselves. It is in this sense they said that the rats are rational because, like the definition of the rational human being, rats are also utility maximizers. They maximize their satisfaction. They take their decisions on the number of taps based on what maximizes their utility. So once they said rats are rational, that begs the question, does that mean humans are also rational? Well, we do carry out a lot of tests on rats, and then the next thing is, before you know it, it's a human beings on the field experiments. So if a medicine works on the rat for some cancer, it's supposed to hopefully work on human beings also. So going by that, you might say that if rats are rational, so should the humans be. But then again, you may scratch your head and say, hang on, a rat is a very simplistic animal, right? Not terribly high on IQ, especially if you compare with humans and so forth. So if rat is a simple animal and therefore rational, we are complex animals. Why should we be behaving exactly like the rat does? So you can again argue it either way. So you still don't have an answer. Are humans irrational or rational for that matter? What makes us irrational is a consistent sort of irrationality. We are not randomly irrational. There is a pattern to the irrationality. That means maybe we are rationally irrational. Or then it begs the question, or could the economists have been wrong after all? Give you an example. Supposing I ask you, I toss a coin, heads, you get 1,000 rupees. Tails, you pay me 1,000 rupees. How many of you will take the game? The simplest probabilistic game, toss of a coin. How many of you will play the game? Very few. Now, why is it? It's a symmetric game. Rational economists will tell you that you should be indifferent because we are indifferent. If we are indifferent, that means we will go either way, which means half of us, we are all a random selection of the same population. Half of us should have said, yes, I will play the game. Other half should have said, no, I will not play the game. Obviously, we are not rational in the sense we are postulated to be rational by the economists. So why do you not want to play this kind of a game where $1,000 you win at the toss of a coin or lose at the toss of a coin? Because losses loom larger than profits in our minds. In the human mind, see, if you're going on the road and find a 500 rupee note, you may, if nobody's watching you, pick it up quietly, but you're not terribly thrilled. But if you lose $500, it rankles a little longer. So the same quantum of loss bothers you a lot more than the same quantum of gain does. Now, this is not what the rational economist tells us, but this will be true of 9 out of 10 human beings. They will not be perfectly equally elated and equally unhappy at the find of $1,000 or loss of $1,000. Or let me give you another example. Supposing you lose some money for some reason, and the amount is determined, say 15,000 rupees. Now, 15,000 rupee loss is 15,000 rupee loss, right? No more, no less. It's quantifiable. We are not talking about opinions and feelings. We are talking about hardcore money. Supposing Nikhil here and I, we are both catching a flight after this event, and our flight is at 9 o'clock, let us say. But he's going to Delhi, I am going to Bombay. But since we have the flights at the same time, 9 o'clock, we both decide we'll share a cab. Then going on that main airport road, there is one terrible accident on the road, which happens once in a 100-year kind of an accident, which choco block fills up the road and there's nothing you can do. You are stuck there, and before you think of turning around, there are a million vehicles behind you. So you can't turn back. The only way to go is forward, because all our cities are designed with only one route to the airport. So we are inching forward and inching forward forever. It takes us 4 hours to reach the airport. It's 1 o'clock in the morning before we reach the airport. I am told, sorry, sir, your flight left on the dot at 9 o'clock. Fine. Nikhil here is told, oh, sir, you are so unlucky. Actually, the captain closed the door 5 minutes ago. Your flight was late by 4 hours because of a blasted tire. You could have caught it had you been 5 minutes early. Now, which one of us feels a greater regret? Our cost of the ticket loss is the same. The cost of having to stay overnight in the city may be the same. The cost of coming back to the city for having missed the flight is the same. Everything is the same in terms of loss. But why is Nikhil more unhappy than I am? There is obviously something else going on in the human mind. Oh, how close and how far? You buy a lottery ticket, do you really expect to win the lottery? With what probability? 1 in 1 million? Now, supposing you get to know that on a 7-digit lottery ticket, 6 digits of yours match the lottery ticket, and you're missed by the last digit, suggesting if you had been just ahead of the next guy, maybe you would have won the lottery. Now, if you miss the lottery by a wide margin, you don't care. Anyway, you're not terribly expecting to win the lottery. But if you miss it by 1 digit, it rankles. Whereas in classical economics of rationality, both should be the same. Our probabilities in both the cases are 1 in 1 million. It just so happens that in one case you won it, in the other case you didn't. But, you missed in both the cases in any case. But you missed by 1 digit versus you missed by a far shot. It makes a difference to the human mind. Not just that. If I ask you, when you're thirsty, what is the value of a Coke? There's some value. Normally the can may be $35. You're willing to pay $50, $60, whatever. A can of Coke. Especially if that can of Coke, see, because I say can of Coke, because if I said burger, you may be worried about cleanliness and so on, right? Whereas here we are talking about a can of Coke. Now, supposing I sit on a beach and I'm going to ask Nikhil, can you go to the main road and get me a Diet Coke when you come back? Nikhil says, sure. But Nikhil knows the place better than I do. And he asks me, there is an air-conditioned restaurant out there, and I can check with them if they will sell a Coke can, and I'll bring it to you. How much are you willing to spend? I'll give some limit. But supposing Nikhil tells me that actually there is a ramshackle vendor out there, but he keeps some Diet Cokes in an ice box. Temperature is the same. Product is the same. Cleanliness is immaterial because it's all in a can. You are going to consume not in the 5-star splendor, but on the beach. He says, how much are you willing to pay? I give some estimate. Which of the two estimates is likely to be higher? If he said it's an air-conditioned restaurant, I may say, okay, up to $120 is okay. But if he says it's a ramshackle thela, I'll say, yeah, 45 bucks, 50 bucks, 60 bucks, not more than that. Why? The product is the same. The satisfaction level is going to be the same drinking that. Temperature is the same. Cleanliness is immaterial. What is making a difference? What is making a difference probably is the unfairness of the thela wala trying to charge 120 bucks. He has no overheads. So we are putting value judgment now. We are not able to take a decision. See, if you are a rational economic being, you should have said it doesn't matter. You'll just give one limit, 120 bucks, whether thela or air-conditioned restaurant, I don't care. But in reality, that will seldom be the case, and it has been experimentally proven by the likes of Thaler. This is Richard Thaler's experiment. You will read about that in the book. So, are you being irrational in giving a lower limit to the thela wala and a higher limit to the air-conditioned restaurant? Classical, neoclassical economists will say you are being irrational because rationally your limit should be the same. Do we really believe that we will give the same limit? No. So then the question is, are we being irrational if we give different limits? And this is a consistent result. It's not one of those things that one guy carried out an experiment and then nobody else reaffirmed it. These have been carried out again and again, and they show the same pattern. Let me give you one other example. Supposing you wanted to see a play. You've been wanting to see that particular play for quite some time, and you bought an advance ticket for 500 rupees. Then you go to the theater to see the play, but you find that, oh my God, I lost the ticket. The question is, will you pay another 500 rupees to buy another ticket if it's available? When asked this question, a lot of people think, oh my God, the play would have been worth 500, but certainly not worth 1,000. So maybe not. A larger percentage of people are reluctant to pay another 500 rupees to see the play. But supposing you go to see a play, you don't have an advance ticket, you just go there to see the play. At the window, you open your wallet and you find, oh my God, I had 3 500 rupee notes, now there are only 2 left. Somewhere while pulling it out of my pocket, I've lost 500 rupees somewhere. And now you are asked, will you pay the other 500 to buy a ticket? Because you still have money. A greater percentage of people consistently and systematically say yes, they will. When you lost a ticket, you were not very keen to buy another ticket for the same money, 500. But when you have lost 500 rupee in cash, you are willing to pay another 500 to see the movie. What is happening? Mental accounting is going on. One was the play account. The play was worth only 500 and not worth 1,000. The other is a general loss account. Maybe I even have a monthly budget of miscellaneous losses of 1,500, I don't know. But that had nothing to do with the play. 500 rupee, what I lost was cash. It had nothing to do with the play. So I'm willing to pay 500 rupees to watch the play. Neoclassical economics will never permit you this kind of irrationality. They call you an irrational fool. But the fact is, most of us are like that. So does that make us irrational? As a matter of fact, you have something to worry about if you think in terms of doctors being irrational. I'll tell you why. I don't know if there is any doctor sitting over here, but 2 random samples of doctors taken from the same population. 2 different samples drawn from the same population of doctors. Because to the same person, if you give 2 different questions slightly altered, it doesn't make sense. So 2 different group of doctors drawn from the same population were asked the following question. One group was asked, a great pandemic is going to hit your town and expected to kill 600 people for sure. But if you use vaccination A, 200 will be saved. But if you use vaccination B, there's a 1/3 chance that 600 will be saved and 2/3 chance that nobody will be saved. And doctors are asked this question, which vaccine do you think they prefer? A, which says 200 will be definitely saved. The other set of doctors are asked the question as follows. A pandemic is going to hit the city and it is estimated to kill 600 people. If vaccine C is used, 400 will die for sure. If vaccine D is used, there's a 1/3 chance that nobody will die. And there's a 2/3 chance that all 600 will die. What do you think was the doctor's response, the majority response? D. Actually, the two are identical questions. Look at this. Where you said 200 will be saved, here you are saying 400 will die out of 600. In the second option, where you say 1/3 chance that 600 will be saved, here we are saying 1/3 chance that nobody will die. The same thing. Correct? And then we said, and 2/3 chance that nobody will be saved. Here we are saying 2/3 chance that 600 will die. So both of them were exactly the same questions, but they were worded differently. But what was happening was, when you talk about lives saved, you tend to be risk averse. When you're getting money, when there is a positive income or positive news, you are risk averse. When there is a payment being made or a cost involved or an outgo involved or lives being lost or death happening, you tend to be risk seeking. You would rather have an uncertain death than a certain death. Similarly, you will rather have a certain life than an uncertain life. Now, are we being irrational in thinking along those lines? But neoclassical economics will tell you that you're being irrational. But we, the behavioral economists, tend to say that, hey, look, most people answer questions like these along the same lines. So there is nothing irrational about it. Because now imagine, if doctors were to be irrational, then we have a bigger problem to worry about than this chat. Along these lines, we actually trace who was the first behavioral economist in the modern sense of the word. Though, there have been people who have made statements on some of these issues even earlier. The 10 Nobel Laureates in the last 4 decades, roughly, who have all been awarded Nobel Prizes for their contributions to behavioral economics. And this book captures that work and shows how the neoclassical economics gradually turned into behavioral economics. It started with the assumption of rational human beings, because in those days, the economists used to look down upon psychologists. Psychology is an imperfect science. What has psychology got to do with economics? Economics is talking about demand and supply and production and consumption and interest rates and inflation and so on. What has that got to do with behavior? Because behavior was a priori given. You are supposed to behave in a certain fashion if your responses are supposed to belong to classical economics. Till the behavioral economists started making steady, gradual inroads to say that, look, if economics is supposed to be decision making by humans, you can't deal with humans as you define to be rational. You have to take people for what they are and then transform economics accordingly. And that is how the neoclassical economics has become behavioral economics today. Now, the answer to are humans irrational is that humans are irrationally rational. And that is why I had to write a book. I can't give an answer in 40 minutes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Raghunathan. That was an amazing presentation. My own journey into behavioral economics was very simple. I was doing my undergrad in economics, but I discovered poker at the same time, and anything that could help me with my poker game was fair game. So I took game theory from economics, but most of the rest of economics just assumed a bunch of stuff. Behavioral economics began to actually tell you something about human beings. And I'll tell you something about poker players. They're very irrational. They're nothing rational about their choices. The second reason was very simple. It was around the time of the great financial crisis. And if you mentioned to people that you were studying economics, nobody invited you to dinner. But if you mentioned that you were a behavioral economist, suddenly you got a dinner invite and everybody wanted to talk to you. This was such a great book, and reading it, for me, it was like a primer in the history of the field. One of the frustrations I always had studying economics was how these models would assume rationality and then write 30 more pages about almost what I felt were fictional agents and fictional individuals. What I found, though, was to try to read some of this work, I needed a background, an economics background, or even a psychology background. Academia in general felt very inaccessible to me with jargon and a lot of presumed knowledge that's highly specific. You talk about it briefly as well in your own journey of writing this book, version 1 versus the final version. And I would love to hear from you how you went from econ speak, which is how Nobel Laureates speak, to English, which is what this book is written in its immensely readable way.
Well, Nikhil, that's a very interesting question for me as an author, because this is a COVID book, period. It was written fully during the COVID period. And it happened because actually I was writing another book. I was wanting to write one book, but what was coming out was a different book. I wanted to say this, but what was coming out compulsively was something else, and I was frustrated. And I said, no, I have to lay off this and think of something else. And when you think of what to write, you typically think in terms of what is it that I can write about. Behavioral economics is something that I've been teaching for almost 25 years in Europe and elsewhere. And I would play many of the games which are there in the book with the students in the MBA classes and so on, sometimes replacing money with the grades. Grades mimic money very well, You want more grades to less grades. I had reasonably read 70% of the works of the leading behavioral economists. So I would have to do some marginal reading, of course, but I thought this was an area I could think of. But then the question was, how do you make a beginning? Behavioral economics, there must be at least 150 leading people writing on behavioral economics worldwide. And there are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of articles and books on the subject. So where do you make a beginning? So then suddenly, in a moment of aha experience, it came to me, why don't I look at, because I remembered Thaler having been a Nobel laureate, I remembered Kahneman having been a Nobel laureate, I remembered Tversky having missed it, though he did all the work with Kahneman, he had missed it. I knew Schiller was a Nobel laureate, I knew Ekerlof was a Nobel laureate. I said, hey, wait a minute, if I can think of 5 or 6 names off my cuff, let me look at how many Nobel Prizes in economics were given to behavioral economists. Then I went back, I counted 10 starting from 1978, nobody before that. So between 1978 and 2020, there were about 10 Nobel laureates who had been cited in their Nobel Prizes for their works on behavioral economics. So I said, okay, now I have a peg to hang the book on, so to speak. Fortunately for me, since I'm an adjunct professor at the Schulich School of Business, their entire library was available to me online. And you see, these days, even to buy one article of a Nobel laureate, you may have to pay $60 to $75. I have more than 325 references in this book. There is no way I could have written this book without access to that library. But in an inspired time frame of 3 months, I wrote the first draft off. I'm not a fast reader, but while I was reading these articles, just the relevant sections would jump at me. And fortunately, I am not a terribly great mathematician myself. Therefore, I didn't have to worry about breaking my head on the maths that goes into it. I just had to concentrate on words, which I could understand. But the book that came out, as Nikhil was hinting at the beginning, was a very serious book. Very academic book. The problem with academic books is you can't even crack a joke. Academics don't get it. Then when I sent it to Penguin, I was fortunate to run into Premanka Goswami, the editor, who was allotted to me. So this editor told me that, hey, your book will be ideal for Oxford University Press, but not for Penguin. Because Oxford University Press is a very academic publisher. It will be read by 235 academics in the world. That's it. And if you're in India, maybe Sage Books, maybe 430 will read it. But he said, if you want it for Penguin, you got to lighten the language. This was the challenging part. I had to rewrite the entire book, and it took me longer than the first draft. I took almost 6 months rewriting the book, giving funkier titles, cracking jokes, making it more conversational, and making it easier, and throwing out jargons as much as I could, and using English instead, as you said. So yes, it was a difficult journey, but it was a fun journey. And the result, thanks to Premanka Goswami, is there. And I also personally, I do like this book, even if I say so myself. But it has come out to my satisfaction. It may not, bust the chart in the world or something, but I love the book.
And as somebody who has read the source material as well, I will say your book is so much more readable than any of those papers. But then that does pose the next question, which is sort of, I guess, why is this an important book? You mentioned in the book that, policymakers, decision makers, founders, students, this is a book applicable for everybody to understand sort of the history of our understanding of human behavior. I'd love to better understand then what you think the significance of this type of behavioral literacy is to these archetypes or these people in this general audience.
If you understand behavioral economics soundly, you can actually put it to use. You can put it to use in policy making. If you recall, Niti Aayog had set up a whole behavioral economic cell. What do you think in Bangalore, in some crossings, you would have seen the mannequins of policemen? Policemen in proper full uniform. What do you think was that? It was nudging you to behave better on the crossing. You see a police uniform, your mind associates it with a policeman, and you tend to slow down or not jump the red light or whatever it is. If you recall, in Bangalore again, in front of one huge pothole in the road, an artist had put a huge crocodile, and it was carried by Times of India, if you recall. What was it trying to do? You can write, oh, Bangalore has 3,012 potholes, or you can say that for the last 6 months, the number of potholes have been growing at the rate of 14% per quarter or whatever. Nothing hits home. You put a crocodile in front of one 3-foot pothole, the whole city notices it. It took a few hours for the BBMP, the unshakable BBMP, to fix that pothole, and a few more. And for the High Court to give certain directions to the city and so on. That is the power of nudging. People are sent elsewhere in the world for taxes. People are told, taxpayers in your region, 98% of the taxpayers in your region have already paid their taxes. Have you? It nudges you into paying the taxes quicker because you are being pitched against others who have done the right thing. In other words, at a much lower cost, behavioral economics can get you to do the right thing. At least that is the hope, the claim, the aim of behavioral economics, that it can be used in many ways for you to modify your behavior where required, to modify others' behavior. So behavioral economics can be used in strategic decision making, but there are also problems. There are critics who will say, oh, that's manipulating people, and that's not fair. Well, welcome. A knife can murder or a knife can cut apples. Nuclear energy can run a power plant or it can bomb the heck out of Ukraine. So there you are. I mean, those are the flip sides.
Well, yeah, so with great power comes great responsibility.
Absolutely.
And you've led into my next question, which is sort of, and I want to talk to you about the ethics. If you're going to, on the left-hand side, talk about the power of nudges, the real question comes now to, there are some small group of people potentially applying behavioral science who understand how this works, and there's almost no really universal set of ethics or a guide for how we should think about implementing these choices, and also thinking about the consequences of the second order effects or the third order effects of these choices. So I'd love to hear from you sort of first, what is your view on ethics, and is that also going to be your next book, which is sort of like a handbook for behavioral scientists such as myself to apply a checklist of ethics?
What you're asking is a profound question, and I'm really not sure ethics can be prescribed. I see where you're coming from, because it's a very important question. You see, one of the key criticism of nudging, thanks to Richard Thaler's works, nudge, some of the examples I gave were about nudging, is that it suffers from two problems. One is it is paternalistic. Libertarian paternalism is the term usually used for that kind of a paternalistic attitude. We know what is right for you. You are being irrational here. Let me guide you towards a rational decision. Some places it may work. For example, there are urinals with a picture of a fly in the middle so that you aim at it and not wet the surrounding areas. Sure, you are nudging, and very desirable nudge. Elsewhere I saw a very nice, in Mindtree I remember, in the urinal it was written, when you drip outside the urinal, please remember another human being has to clean it. That's a nudge, very powerful nudge. These are all good nudges, I would imagine. But unfortunately, not all nudges are that noble.
I'd argue it's like an iceberg. 90% of them are pretty coercive and manipulative.
But that is true. You see, when anything new comes around, there are as many crooks or maybe more crooks than the good guys planning to see how I can misuse it. And all the more reason why you should learn about it so that you can avoid that pitfall. For example, there's something in behavioral economics called anchoring effect. If you go for a job interview and the interviewer says, what is your expectation? Often we get into, no, you suggest first, and the guy will say, no, what is your expectation? You tell us. Smart thing to do is you be the first to tell what you expect. And there are researches evidently showing that the higher amount you ask for, the higher you are likely to get. Because you have set the anchor. If you say, I am worth 85 lakhs, when I am actually worth 1.5 crore, what you are saying is you are underselling yourself, because thereafter there is no way you can go back to that. If the other guy said 85 lakhs, it's very difficult for you to take yourself to 1.5 crore. But if you said 2 crore, that guy will think 25 times before suggesting 85 lakhs. So he is more likely to come to 1.2 or 1.3 maybe. So the anchor sets the base of the final arrival of the negotiation. Right? So this is called the anchoring effect. But now supposing you have understood this, but by chance the interviewer himself starts with a very low salary. What can you do now? You have read my book, but what should your answer be? The only way to come back will be show great insult. What? Are you out of your mind? What are you wasting your time and my time for, and get up? Then he will know that he has made a big mistake. So that's the only option left. Or else be smart enough to be the first guy to name your price, which is high enough. Even if it is absurdly high, doesn't matter. So what I'm saying is, once you understand, you can play against those strategies. If you are behavioral economics literate, you'll be able to counter some of these. So there are many ways, or where you think you can genuinely, for a good purpose, modify people's behavior. Not dripping urine outside the bowl is a very noble intent. Or collecting money for COVID may be a good intent, and you may use it a little bit, but even that is manipulative. But there are degrees of manipulation. And ethics, as I said, ultimately it's higher dharma. Even Krishna was not able to finally say what is ethical. He only said, look for what is a higher dharma and go with it, which means smaller dharma is okay. Killing an uncle or a teacher or a cousin is okay as long as you protect your kingdom. So ethics is very difficult to bring a book out on. And again, it will be paternalistic. The means and the ends.
Yes, exactly.
Sometimes the means, the aims themselves are questionable. Yeah. At other times, while the aims may not be questionable, the means are questionable. So these are somewhat, one can self-regulate and correct. But these are the broad categories of criticism against the application of behavioral economics. But that is bound to be there. We still argue about a lot of things on both sides. Democracy, is it good or bad? So often we say everything that is wrong about India is because of our democracy. And everything which is right about China is because they are an autocracy. So, there are problems any which way.
It'll take its time.
Yeah.
Ethics is something that I struggled with. So the first part of my career was at a development economics agency, Busara Center, where the ends were always justified. So then it was a function of how do we find the means. My second stint was at a large private sector bank in Australia. There the ends are potentially questionable, but it breaks down to sort of how then do you think a person applying it, and I suppose I will have to search for my higher dharma.
Go for the higher dharma.
Higher dharma. But on the other side of it, I want to also talk about, so right now there's a lot of discussion on the power of nudges, but also the modest effects we've seen in the market or in the world around nudges. Historically or famously, people would say, if you want a 5% increment gain, behavioral economics is your cup of tea and something that'll help you. But if you want like a 50% or 200% or a 3x change, then don't go for the small nudge here or there. Think bigger. And there has been some criticism most recently, as of this month, from some prominent behavioral scientists around the fact that maybe behavioral science, behavioral economics, even all of the work so far by Nobel Laureates has focused a bit too much on the individual level effects of anchoring here versus altruism there, and not enough at the system level of how we think about designing systems and also the second order effects your anchoring intervention or nudge might have. That sort of, I wouldn't say put the field in a crisis, but it is definitely at an inflection point, it feels like, where some are even claiming that it's the death of nudge. I wanted to get your comment more broadly on sort of this trend and sort of the future of behavioral science as you see it.
Nikhil, I am becoming a fan of yours. You're asking some very profound and very, very good questions. Not easy to answer though. But look at it this way. Anything new, people tend to exaggerate its efficacy and benefits and so on. But ultimately, the world absorbs it at its own pace. If you look at Elinor Ostrom or Williamson, information economics, or the tragedy of commons, these are all institutional mechanisms. Or even things like contracting. How do you contract to modify behavior? Contractual arrangements which will modify behavior, which will reduce moral hazard, and so forth. There are institutional interventions also that many behavioral economists have studied. But what happens is that Richard Thaler or Kahneman and Tversky's kind of work is sexier. Immediately you understand. Everybody, schoolboys are excited. Some schools have asked me to give a talk to them and so on. The fact is the institutional organizational arrangements that you talked about are also there in the picture, and this book concentrates on those as well. Even though I am saying that these are sexier, I have also devoted more pages to Kahneman and Thaler. Because they have done the sheer body of work is so enormous that you can't but do it. So the body of work is enormous, and that suddenly gives people a hope, as if behavioral economics will set every problem of the world right. No. I'll give you a small example. Have you seen people in the villages drawing water from wells? Or pictures of them? There are people standing at the lip of the well, and just with brute arms force, they are pulling the rope out. We see them in villages even today, or even if it's through a pulley, they are just pulling it. But until the bucket has come on top and they pulled it, there is no relaxing for the person drawing the water. Now actually, there is a very simple mechanism of a small pulley through which the rope also passes, which has a fly. So when you let the rope down, the fly comes down and the rope goes down, takes the water and it's coming up. And if you stop at any point, the fly catches the rope with the friction. So one way the fly goes down and the rope goes down. But when the rope comes up, the fly is with friction. It stops the rope, so that if the person pulling the rope wants a little bit of rest for the arms, they can actually do that. What percentage of Indian wells have that fly attached?
I'll guess 15%.
It will be even probably lower, of that order. Now, this is the simplest mechanical intervention one can think of. Why? And this was probably discovered God knows when. We haven't been able to change everything. But then we expect that behavioral economics, which is 30-year-old, will change all the problems of the world. It's not going to happen. Against nudge, there's also something called sludge. Nudge is what smoothens a decision-making process, what lubricates the decision-making process in the general direction of the desirable behavior. Sludge is, why do you think banks make it impossible for you to navigate their customer support system? Anything but support. They'll say 1, 2, 3, 4. But your problem is nothing to do with the 4. And Citibank, for example, will never allow you to talk to a human being no matter what. You cannot talk to a human being, full stop. That's sludge for you. When I change my mobile phone, my number portability goes with it these days at least. But if I change my bank, with every bank, there are 50 different inputs with every bank. If I change my bank from one to the next, why is it that this entire thing cannot be ported to the other bank? With today's technology, it should not be too difficult. But that is sludge for you. Somebody sitting somewhere doesn't want things to move that easily. So there is that friction also. So not everybody wants behavioral economists or those who understand behavioral economics to have their say. Okay? So that's the friction.
And I'll give you another example for the audience of sludge. So if anybody's ordered on Swiggy, when you're ordering on the ordering page and filling out your basket, the app will tell you when you're eligible for a discount. It'll show it in green. And then the minute you hit that number, whatever it is, it'll sort of say, yay, congratulations, you're saving this much money. You go on to the next screen, and it's not automatically added to your bill. There's an innocuous little button that you have to click into and then go and apply
That's sludge for you.
It's a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right.
Exactly.
And maybe they don't want...
So these are the reasons why the transformation is being slower than you will expect.
Understood. Yeah. And so in the book, you talk about how economists for the longest time have, used Homo economicus as sort of like this caricature. And the reality is we're more Homer Simpson. But you draw the importance of culture. And you say maybe we should actually be Homo culturalis. In that frame, I would love to hear your views on the impact of culture on behavior, how far we've gotten on generalizing human behavior. But I also want to highlight that a lot of the experimental work that Nobel Prize winners tend to do tends to come from what they call weird contexts. So Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies, which represents a very small fraction of the humans on this planet. So how do we reconcile Homo economicus, Homo culturalis, the importance of culture, and then maybe even the lack of representation of a lot of humans in existing research today?
See, some of these are a criticism on the experimental methods. As a matter of fact, there's something worse than what you said. It's not only Western guys. 80% of the researchers are on the MBA students of the American professors, including Richard Thaler and Kahneman.
For grades.
And Tversky.
Yeah, and for grades.
Not for grades. Most of them are using small amount of money, $10 and $15 and so on. But the fact is they are only about MBA students, not even about the general population. However, experimental designs can evolve. It takes time, especially in social sciences, for experimentation to evolve over a period of time. Yes, the original economist's rational man was Homo economicus. See, unless they use these fancy terms, nobody will consider them a scholar. You can't say rational man. A Raghunathan can say that because he's not a serious researcher sitting in MIT. But an MIT professor has to say Homo economicus. And behavioral economists have to keep up with them and therefore say Homo culturalis. Cultured man. A cultured man is a complex man with all the greed that goes with it, the fear, the jealousies, the pettiness, the ecstasies, the happiness, the sadness, everything that goes with the human sentiments. And many of them are also cultural. For instance, the worldview of the oppressed may not be the same as the worldview of the oppressors. Ask Africans or look at ourselves today. Many of this extremism that we see in the comeback of the Hindu revivalism comes from our cultural background of what we have suffered or gone through. Whereas, if you look at it from a Britisher's viewpoint, Belgium even today doesn't talk about Congo. Congo is nowhere in the history of Belgium. So if they were to come out with any experiments, where will be the place for a Congoan? Rather than find fault with them, I would also find fault with ourselves. Why is it that we are not able to replicate the same experiments with our people here? After all, today, India is one of the biggest markets in the world. Today, probably the Americans will want to know more about the behavior of Indian purchasers or consumers than an American purchaser or consumer, because incrementally they are more likely to sell more cars in a market like India than in a saturated market like the US. So why is it that we are not seeing opportunities? Why do we want even research in our context to come from the Westerners? Our country has never had an R&D culture. Even today, India spends less than 1.25% of the GDP on researchers. Whereas in developed countries, the percentage is as high as 8, 9, or even 12%, depending on the country that you're speaking about. So we don't have a research culture. In fact, I recall 4 years ago, AICT, the All India Council of Technical Education, said for the purposes of promotion, publication is not necessary. We are saying creation of knowledge is no longer important. You can be promoted without publishing a single paper. So I am saying much of us have to look at ourselves before we look at them and say, oh, they have done researches only in the Western context, but all the Nobel laureates here are Westerners. Why should they do research and spend, though they have. Yeah. I have mentioned quite a few of them who have done some work in India also. Tragedy of Commons, they've also done things in Nepal, in India, and so forth. Let us not find fault with them. Let us find fault with ourselves.
It's a cause close to my heart, but I think that this book, it has inspired a lot in me to think about how do we, sort of get that research culture here as we I hope everybody reads this book and has some good ideas for how we can do more of this in India. So thank you so much, Raghu.
Thank you, Nikhil. I should thank you.
And thank you all for being such an amazing audience.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.